Hello, my fellow weirdlings, it's Margot, and today we're deep diving into the mystery of Mel's Hole. So if you're interested in bottomless pits, animal resurrection, fried sheep, government cover-ups, alternate dimensions, hollow earth theory, miracle cures, extraterrestrial laser beams, fetal seals, or hearing about how the Manson family fits into this saga, get comfortable. This is gonna be a long one. While it's possible Curiositas County locals knew of this mystical hole for generations, it first showed up on the public's radar when a man calling himself Mel Waters was a call-in guest on Art Bell's popular paranormal radio show, Coast To Coast A.M., on February 21, 1997. Mel had previously faxed the show, describing a seemingly bottomless hole on his property that he was convinced had paranormal attributes. Of course, that sort of story warranted an interview. In fact, Mel had such an interesting story, he returned to the radio show multiple times, once in 2000 and twice in 2002. The epic narrative I've pieced together here comes directly from Mel Waters, telling his own story over the course of those broadcasts. I'll include links to the nearly 6 hours worth of recordings of Mel's phone calls with Art Bell in this video's description, so you can hear their conversations for yourself. If you do, I'd love to hear if you reached the same conclusions I did, or spotted something I missed. In his first call to Coast A.M., Mel claimed he owned property about 9 miles west of Ellensburg, Washington, in Curiositas County, in a rural area called Monastash Ridge. On this property was the mysterious hole, which Mel described as being roughly 9 feet across and at least 80,000 feet deep. That's the equivalent of over 15 miles. He came to this conclusion after doing various depth measurement experiments, which included lowering 80,000 feet of weighted fishing line into the hole with a very strong fishing pole. Mel had previously been a shark fisherman in California. He claimed the line never touched bottom. The walls of Mel's hole were said to be constructed of hand-placed bricks, stretching 15 feet down before transitioning into dirt and darkness. The opening was surrounded by a retaining wall, and the hole was normally kept covered to prevent accidents. According to Mel, the locals knew all about his hole, and had for decades before he'd even acquired the property on Monastash Ridge. In fact, one elderly neighbor reportedly told him that the hole had previously been surrounded by an arrangement of standing stones, similar to Stonehenge. Mel said his neighbors had been discarding things they didn't want by throwing them into the hole for years, including trash, truckloads of old tires, large appliances like refrigerators, and even dead cattle. Seemingly nobody questioned the bottomless nature of the hole, but no matter how much they chucked in there, it never filled up, and no sound of the object hitting the bottom was ever heard. Mel said the locals had always referred to the pit as the Devil's Hole, as they found it mysteriously unsettling, though it's also been claimed the Devil's Hole is actually another hole that's often confused with Mel's. Either way, that's not really important. Though he admittedly never saw it himself, he said neighbors told him that the hole would occasionally emit a black beam of light toward the sky. After talking about it on Art Bell's show, Mel said he'd heard from a lot of truckers that when stopping at a rest stop on a nearby highway that goes to Yakima, Washington, they'd also sometimes look toward Monastash Ridge and see that black beam of light. He said, "This is a contradiction, but a black beam of light, okay, comes from the hole. It lasts a very short time, but it just goes directly up to the sky, as if you had a flashlight and it was capable of throwing up a solid black beam." Some coast-to-coast listeners have hypothesized that this beam was shot from subterranean, hollow earth dwelling, or interdimensional extraterrestrial laser beams. If you weren't familiar with Art Bell, his listeners were known to hypothesize a lot of things. Apparently only Mel possessed the intelligence and curiosity to attempt to get to the bottom of all of this, literally and figuratively. This led to a very unique series of quasi-scientific experimentation. One series of tests involved sound. These included yelling into the pit. Expecting to hear an echo, he was surprised to be answered with silence instead. He also brought a handheld radio near the hole. To his ears, it sounded as if it played differently, as if it were playing from decades in the past. Another claim Mel made was that metal would change into other metal substances when held close to the hole's opening. Another noticeable quirk about the hole was that animals appeared to hate it. Naturally, animals would probably avoid an open 15-mile-deep pit, but no animal would even go near it. Mel's dogs would dig their paws into the ground in protest whenever he'd try to drag them anywhere near the hole. Even more strangely, it was noted that even birds avoided flying over the hole. Reportedly, the only signs of wildlife seen anywhere near Mel's hole were piles of bones strewn around the mouth of the pit. Mel described a strange feeling the hole emitted as being similar to being surprised by the moon, like when for a moment when you go out at night you're wondering what that eerie light is and realize, oh, it's the moon. One of the stranger stories to come from Mel's hole, and one of the stranger things to go into it, involved a neighbor's dog. According to Mel, a local man threw his dead hunting dog into the hole. Soon after, the dog was seen by his owner running through the woods, seemingly very much alive and still wearing its collar. When the man called out to the dog, it showed no signs of recognizing its owner. The hunter told Mel that the dog was behaving as if it were out hunting with somebody else. Somebody its owner was unable to see. Upon hearing this story, Mel wrote in his will that he wanted to be tossed down the hole upon his own death, to see whether or not he'd come back from the dead, like the dog had done. Almost immediately after sharing his story on Art Bell's radio show, Mel claimed that government agents approached him and told him there was a plane crash on his land, so he couldn't go near his property. They informed him that if he came back to the property or made trouble, they could accuse him of being a manufacturer of illegal drugs and seize the property while also sending him to prison. Because Mel had what he called a lab on his property, where he experimented with legal medicinal Native American plants historically used to cure the flu and the like, Mel assumed it would be pretty easy for the government to make that lab appear to be something very illegal, like a meth lab, so he quietly vacated his property. He later insisted to Art Bell that the plants he experimented with had no hallucinogenic properties, because of course that question had to arise at some point. He said the government then offered to pay him about $250,000 a month to lease the land in perpetuity, and he eventually agreed. These payments are said to have continued from March of 1997 to the beginning of 2000. Mel used that income to move to Perth, Australia, where he started a wombat rescue and continued his experiments with medicinal plants. He said some of the plants that he'd been able to bring with him that were grown near his hole had more advanced healing and curing attributes than those that were grown elsewhere. He claimed that while in Australia, he'd given some of his plants from the Washington property to the Ministry of Health, and they'd managed to seemingly cure multiple AIDS patients who were near death. When Mel finally returned to the U.S., mainly because he wanted to see his family, he helped his nephew move, and had plans to talk to Art Bell again on his radio show, but he never called in at the allotted time. Mel later alleged that he'd boarded a bus where there had been an altercation that he wasn't involved in. The police and transit authority arrived and said he had to stick around to give them a witness statement. And he didn't remember anything else until he woke up in an alley in San Francisco 12 days later, surrounded by homeless people who were asking him to sing On the Road Again. Mel explained that he bore a strong resemblance to Willie Nelson. He had IV marks and tape residue on his arm, was missing all of his back teeth and his homemade belt buckle, and had no memory of what had transpired. He had no ID and could still taste blood from the dental extractions. Mel mostly seemed upset that they'd taken his belt buckle, which he'd made himself and was pretty attached to. He mentioned it was made from a bent silver fork with a few old coins affixed to it. This seemingly inconsequential detail becomes surprisingly relevant later. When he finally made it back to his property in Washington state, he felt that menacing strangers were stalking him around town, and found the hole guarded by helicopters and a black van. At that time, government officials informed Mel the land was no longer his. He alleged his assets were then frozen, and his Australian wombat rescue shut down. He was left penniless and homeless. Mel was so broke at this point, he was selling his plasma just to afford to buy cigarettes, and had been staying with his nephew. He told Art Bell he had a hole, and now he's been shafted. Another event that coincided with all of this was that Mel supposedly found out his ex-wife was taking legal action against him due to violations of their lease agreement on the Washington property, which had been agreed upon in their divorce settlement. The property actually legally belonged to his ex-wife, and he had permission to use it as he pleased, basically forever, as long as he didn't make any alterations to it. In the few years it had been under government control, they'd installed an underground fuel line, septic system, and paved roads. Mel claimed that while he was getting rich off leasing the property to the government, he'd paid his ex-wife $25,000 a month, so this lawsuit seemingly totally blindsided him. Since there was no way for his ex-wife to access the land and naturally discover those alterations, he figured the government must have made some sort of deal with her and put her up to filing the lawsuit. He actually expressed concern for her safety because since filing the lawsuit, she'd completely vanished. He assumed she may have changed her name. Mel also stated in that same conversation that he'd like to track down a Mexican man who'd discarded thousands of tires down the hole over the years, a Catholic priest with some sort of experience with the hole, and a Hungarian man who seemed to be connected to the hole and the priest. Another man Mel wanted to speak to was one he'd given an old gun to years earlier. He'd dug up a gun and holster near the hole, and when he had to move off his property due to damage from a snowstorm before the government took it over, he'd given them to a landlord as a deposit. He described the gun as being like an old Nazi P-38 from World War II. He found out the man he gave the gun to later became obsessed with it and had left his wife and family and simply vanished. The son of the man he'd given the gun to told him that when his father would shoot the gun, it would make no sound. He also said that when he'd set the gun down next to a radio, it would pick up signals from all over the world and from different eras of time. He could wave his hands and it would change broadcasts. You know, I think I'd get obsessed with an object that behaved like that too. But that wasn't the only odd object Mel dug up near the hole. He said all sorts of random odds and ends would turn up on the property. In a later call, the topic of the bent fork belt buckle came up again. Mel gave more of a detailed backstory on that, explaining how he'd made 10 of them and sold them through Ellensburg's farmers market and jewelry stores, and kept the one for himself. He eventually went back to Ellensburg to see if he could find any of the buckles he'd sold years earlier, to replace the one that had been taken from him. At that time, he still couldn't understand why they'd have wanted to confiscate something so personal, just a homemade piece of folk art. In Ellensburg, Mel actually ran into a guy who had bought one of the buckles. As I mentioned earlier, the buckles were made of a bent silver fork with some old coins attached, 3 very specific old coins actually. One of Winston Churchill, one of Joseph Stalin, and a 1943 Roosevelt dime. This was meant to commemorate the Yalta or Crimea Conference held in February of 1945, which was the World War II meeting of the heads of government of the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union to discuss the post-war reorganization of Germany and Europe. But that's neither here nor there. The real point of interest was the date on the Roosevelt dime, 1943. When the Roosevelt dimes were originally made, they sped up the process to get them out into circulation quickly, right after he died. And that didn't happen until April 12, 1945. No Roosevelt dime should have existed yet in 1943. The man who owned the belt buckle took it to a coin dealer, who said the only explanation he could come up with was that it could have been a prototype. He offered a lot of money for the coin, but its owner said he'd have to think about it. Days later, the belt buckle owner was approached by people from the U.S. Treasury, who said they had to confiscate the coin. Another weird thing Mel noticed about the dimes was that they had the mint mark letter B on them. Other dimes display the letter S, P, D, or W on them to indicate where the coin was minted. S for San Francisco, P for Philadelphia, D for Denver, W for West Point. We've never had a mint location that began with a B. So where did Mel come across this non-existent coin in the first place? Buried near his mystery hole, of course. He said he was digging a hole for one of his plants many years earlier and found a Chinese lucky money envelope containing 10 of those dimes, which he'd used to make the 10 belt buckles. So I guess there are still 8 more of them out there somewhere. At least this finally explained why anyone would be interested in confiscating Mel's homemade belt buckle. There's really no explanation for these 1943 Roosevelt dimes being in existence. It's been discussed that even normal time travel couldn't explain this, though the existence of a parallel universe could. Art Bell suggested that in a parallel universe, the letter B could stand for a U.S. mint located in Boston, or if things went differently at the end of World War II or at that Yalta conference, it could even stand for Berlin. Art mentioned that after his initial radio broadcasts on Mel's Hole, a TV crew had gone out to Monastash Ridge. They didn't find the hole, but they did find a lot of military boot prints in the area, and a lot of information that the military had been there or was still there. Another interesting claim made by Mel was that a trucker buddy of his told him he'd delivered a huge quantity of fiber optic cable to a warehouse in Ellensburg. The trucker said all of the guys at the warehouse who'd accepted the delivery were Israeli. He said another trucker had claimed to deliver a number of large crates of equipment from Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in California, apparently to that same Ellensburg warehouse. In 2000, Mel shared an email address where listeners could contact him if they had any information on the men he was looking for, or any insight at all into solving the hole's mysteries. He was convinced others knew the true nature of his mystery hole, but refused to tell him. It turns out giving out that email address on the air really paid off, and Mel was able to return to Coast A.M. 2 years later with a whole new story to tell. At this point, I'll introduce you to Mel's second hole, where his experiments took a much darker and more interesting turn. This chapter of the Mel's Hole saga began when Mel received an email from members of an unnamed Native American tribe located in northwestern Nevada. They initially said they wanted to connect with him to share information about the plants he and they had simultaneously been researching, which he'd mentioned on Art Bell's show. He said he went out there to meet with them in early September of 2001, just before 9/11. They talked plants as expected, and then Mel asked if they'd ever encountered plants like those that had grown near his hole in Washington, the ones that had seemingly cured AIDS in Australia. They responded by taking him to a second seemingly bottomless mystery hole located nearby on public land, under the management of the Federal Bureau of Land Management. Like Mel's hole, this hole was also said to be locally known as the Devil's Hole. The two holes had many similarities, but also some remarkable differences. According to Mel, that land was used by members of the Basque community for grazing sheep. It was otherwise pretty pristine, with no roads or signs of habitation. He described the second hole as being 9 feet in diameter, the same as the one on his property. Unlike his hole, however, he claimed the Nevada hole had a solid metal liner sticking out of the ground like a collar, 2 feet high, 2 feet deep, with several notches in it. On Art Bell's show, Mel speculated that, quote, "In my estimation, it could possibly be a locking collar. Something could be lowered into it and locked into place." He claimed the collar was made of a substance that possessed unusual paranormal properties. He said that when he accidentally dropped a box wrench on the metal collar, the impact didn't make a noise. He deduced that meant that the collar somehow absorbed the sound or energy. He insisted you could pound on it with a sledgehammer, and it wouldn't make a noise. He claimed the hole was solidly lined with that same metal as far down as the eye could see. He said that nothing seemed natural about this hole at all, but if it was modified, it was done long before the necessary technology existed. He further claimed that even in winter, the area around the metal collar was warm to the touch and would keep nearby tents warm. However, the collar itself was never hot to the touch. He said local Basque had told him that the hole had been there in its current state for their community's entire recollection, dating back to at least the 19th century. The locals had never lowered anything into it to test its depth. They did say animals were afraid of it, exactly like Mel's hole in Washington. However, another of Mel's anecdotes about the Nevada hole involved unidentifiable species of birds seen flying around the pit. When Mel attempted to shoot one down for later study, the bullet appeared to ricochet off them. He also said many locals had witnessed a black beam of light shooting out of the hole toward the sky on multiple occasions. Due to these similarities, and because there's a whale bone mysteriously embedded in a tree in Ellensburg, Washington, 100 miles from the ocean, and not far from the first hole on his own property, Mel speculated that his hole's origins may also have had a connection to the Basque community, since they've long been some of the most famous whalers in the world. He claimed the Basque had told him they'd left the whalebone in Ellensburg long ago as a marker. However, most people, including whaling history experts, believe a sea captain once stayed on the property where the tree is located and had displayed the jawbones of one of his catches in the front yard. Over time, the tree grew around a section of the bone. Regardless, it seems the local Basque community near the hole in Nevada were a valuable source of information and camaraderie for Mel. But because neither Mel, nor the nearby indigenous community, nor the local Basque community had much money to throw into a bottomless hole in the desert, they had to keep their experiments simple. Mel claimed that he and several Basque locals performed one experiment wherein they bought some bags of ice from 7-Eleven and lowered a bucket of ice into the hole, keeping another bucket of ice at the surface as a control. The purpose of this experiment was to find out if it was hot or cold in the hole. They had access to a winch and 1,500 feet of line. The plan was to retrieve the bucket from the hole by the time half the ice in the bucket on the surface had melted. But the ice lowered into the hole never did melt, though the hole was seemingly radiating as much heat as ever. The ice appeared exactly as it had before it was lowered into the hole, though curiously it was no longer cold to the touch. It felt like ice but wasn't cold, and didn't melt at all in Mel's hand as ice normally would. Art Bell compared Mel's description to the ice resembling blocks of glass, and Mel agreed. Mel said the ice had been changed in an undefined way. It had a texture like silica desiccant, the stuff in those little Stay Fresh packets labeled Do Not Eat that are found in some food packages, new shoes, medicine bottles, and other products. He noted it also never made any noise during the entire process. Furthermore, when they placed the unmelted ice on their cooking fire, it began to burn instead of melting. Mel described the resulting fire as not so much a flame as kind of a, have you ever used a gas stove? It was like the barest turning of a gas stove on. It was like that last flicker before you turn it off. When they removed it from the fire and set it on the dirt, it was still burning. Mel said you could separate the cubes and each one was exhibiting the same properties. Mel and his companions repeated the experiment multiple times, which resulted alternately in melted ice, unchanged ice, and about 1 in 3 times a recurrence of the burning ice. At the time of his interview with Art 4 months later, Mel said the ice was still burning in the bucket as far as he knew. Art asked if it seemed to be giving off eternal heat. Mel replied that when the ice came out of the hole, it was neutral. When they put it on the fire, it looked like it was doing combustion in a different way than we'd normally describe combustion, by mixing air and heat and flame, but doing kind of the same thing. He thought it must have had some sort of chemical reaction. He claimed the new substance the ice had become could even be used as a source of heat. He said one guy took some stuff home. He put it in his wood stove, and the thing's been keeping his place warm for over 3 months, September to January. Mel said he hadn't taken any himself because it didn't belong to him. It belonged to the locals who'd taken him there. The Basque man allegedly reported to Mel that he kept a kettle of water on top of his wood stove, as most people do, to prevent the air in the room from becoming too dry. He noticed the air in his cabin was drier than ever, though. His skin was flaking and he was always thirsty. One evening, the man noticed the steam from the kettle, which should have been moving upward, looked like it was being absorbed down into the stove. Not through the door or any opening in the stove, but through the actual cast iron stove. He was really happy with the nonstop heat the weird ice was producing, though, so he kept using it. With heating costs what they are, I can't say that I blame him. After a few months, the man returned home to find that the stove holding the burning ice had crashed through the cabin's hearth and floor for no discernible reason. Now, this cabin was described as more of a flimsy shack than a permanent building, but it had always been sturdy enough to support the weight of the wood stove up until then. The stove was then sitting on the ground about 1 foot below the cabin floor. Mel described this particular man as not so bright, and said that instead of trying to do anything to retrieve the stove or fix the floor, he extended his stovepipe to reattach the stove to the chimney from its new position. He continued using the stove as it sat. The burning ice didn't give off any gas or smoke or anything, so he figured it probably wouldn't do much harm. A couple weeks later, the man returned home to find his entire cabin had collapsed. All that were left were piles of wood dust, like the cabin had disintegrated. It looked like all of the moisture that was in the wood had been sucked out completely, to the point that it could no longer exist as wood. The man abandoned the cabin and moved in with one of his brothers. About a month later, the man brought his brothers to see the debris. At that point, the stove had sunk 5 feet into the ground, still radiating heat. The wood dust had blown away, and all that were left were some nails and a rectangular hole a little bigger than the wood stove. They noticed the hole it made was reportedly really smooth all around it, like it had melted into some sort of glass. This is when the men contacted Mel, who surprisingly got in touch with a government contact he had from his days in Australia. The government agent said it was really important for Mel to tell him where the cabin was located and how to get to it. There seemed to be a sense of urgency in his voice. The guy who owned the wood stove was a squatter on public land, and there was no way to trace him to the shack he'd been living in, so he told Mel to go ahead and give the man the information. To Mel's surprise, a research team was quickly dispatched there. The Basque guy who had lived in the cabin was able to watch from a distance as the researchers brought in a bunch of heavy equipment, cranes and such. The stove had seemingly sunk deeper into the ground, and the crew struggled to raise it. They kept bringing in heavier equipment, bigger cranes, but still couldn't remove the stove from the ground. They lowered chains into the ground and poured some water in the hole. Mel assumed that somehow the water, metal, and chain all congealed together, holding fast like glue to whatever was in the hole. Eventually, they were able to hoist the stove out of the ground using multiple cranes, described by Mel as monster cranes. The Basque man said they then loaded the stove onto the biggest truck he'd seen in his life and hauled it away. Art Bell wondered if this is how the seemingly bottomless holes had been made in the first place, by something like this weird ice substance burrowing an object deeper and deeper into the ground. That seems like a valid question. If you have an affinity for sheep or sensitivity to hearing about harm befalling animals, you're probably going to want to skip ahead to the next chapter. This description gets a bit graphic. If it helps ease your mind, there's a good chance this scenario didn't even actually happen. According to the story, this is when Mel decided to go full mad scientist on his second hole. The next experiment involved lowering a live 120 to 150 pound sheep into the Nevada mystery hole to a depth of 1,500 feet. To be fair, Mel did seem very remorseful for allowing this to happen and claimed it wasn't his idea, that members of the group of Basque men he was with basically insisted on it. Mel apparently got a lot of flack later for agreeing to it and said he was thoroughly ashamed of it. In my opinion, this experiment would have made just as much sense with a previously deceased sheep, and even more sense with a camera and high-powered flashlight. Perhaps they should have entertained one other Basque man's idea instead, to lower marijuana into the hole to see if it would improve its properties. Mel said the idea of lowering a sheep into the hole arose after a young, adventurous, stubborn, and one could argue stupid, Basque man insisted on being lowered into the hole himself. Nobody thought that was a good idea after seeing what the hole had done to the ice, considering the young man was made mostly of water. Mel pointed out that the Basque as a race are known for being rather fearless. Mel claimed the sheep became agitated while being led to the hole, which resulted in one of the men stunning the sheep by hitting it between the eyes, before placing it into the crate and attaching a cable. As they were winching it over the hole, the sheep awoke and began thrashing around and screaming. Mel described the sheep as making the most piercing, horrible, ghastly noises until they got it directly over the hole. Then it went dead silent. The sheep was still thrashing but making no sound, which seemed to be another case of the hole somehow absorbing all of the sound that goes into it. As the crate reached a depth of about 700 feet, there were no longer signs of movement from the sheep. When the cable had been lowered to its full length of 1,500 feet, the metal collar around the hole began to vibrate, and Mel described feeling something like static electricity from the top. The sheep was reportedly left at that depth for 30 minutes, before being hoisted back to the surface, where it was discovered that the sheep had died. From an external perspective, the sheep and the crate looked fine, but internally, the sheep looked like it had been cooked, and the flesh inside was hot. This was discovered when a Basque butcher laid the sheep out on a table and began performing a dissection. Mel also observed that the sheep's body cavity, where the internal organs would normally be, was filled with a jellied blob, which he described as looking like a huge, hideous tumor, measuring about 2 feet long. When the purported tumor was removed, the experimenters could see a pulsing movement inside of it, sort of like a heartbeat. The tumor was tough to cut into, but when it was opened, they found what they described as a live fetal seal, about 18 inches long with flippers and human-looking eyes, connected to the tumor by an umbilical cord. The seal-like creature's eyes were opening and closing, and its flippers were moving. It stared at the men as if studying them, and then separated from the tumor without assistance and started moving around the table. Even the fearless Basque men took a step back, totally freaked out. Mel felt like he was in the presence of something beyond extraordinary. He wasn't religious, but this nearly felt like a religious experience to him. One of the men suggested that they club the seal creature to death, but cooler heads prevailed. The creature moved to the edge of the table and looked like it was going to fall off. Mel approached the creature and it looked directly at him, seeming to have some sort of connection with them. Mel picked the creature up and set it on the ground. This left a slimy residue on his hands that surprisingly smelled like ozone. The stunned men stood staring at the creature, and it stared back at them, each one in turn, described by Mel as intelligently. This went on for about 2 hours. During that time, only the seal creature's head moved to look at each of the men. Eventually, the seal creature waddled toward the hole while still staring at them, with what Mel described as the most compassionate look he'd ever seen from any face. When the seal creature waddled toward the hole again, Mel got the feeling it wanted to go up on the ledge of the collar, so he picked it up and set it there. At this point, he was no longer afraid of the strange creature. It moved around the collar for about an hour. Then it gave them one last look and a slow nod, then turned and soundlessly dropped back into the hole. Everyone there felt completely drained at that point. Even retelling the story, Mel seemed emotionally and physically drained. After finishing their experimentation, the night before Mel left Nevada, the group got together with the rest of the Basque community and some of their indigenous friends to relax and decompress in a sort of casual party atmosphere. There, Mel spoke at length with an 80-year-old Basque elder who said he'd always gone to the hole for spiritual connection. The elder hadn't experienced any of the weirdness of the hole that Mel had, but he didn't seem surprised by what Mel was telling him. When it was time for the elder to go to bed, he clasped Mel's hand as he was leaving and put something in it. He said, "Put that away." Mel put it in his pocket and continued sitting around talking with the elder's family. When one of them asked, "Aren't you going to look at what great-grandfather gave you?" he took it out of his pocket and discovered it was a 1943 Roosevelt dime, just like the ones he'd found on his own property. The family said the elder had found a Chinese envelope, possibly as far back as 1943, containing those dimes, just as Mel had, and insisted he keep it when he tried to tell them how valuable it was. There's no way the elder could have known about Mel's dimes. According to Mel, the Basque had many more experiences with the seal creature after that. They even found a way to communicate with it through the radio of one of their boom boxes. At one point, one of the Basque even managed to capture a recording, but when he played it back, it was unintelligible and sounded like the inner modulation you get, the series of chirps, bloops, and bleeps, when listening to a shortwave radio. Mel claimed he had a copy of the recording, but didn't have it handy at the time of Art Bell's broadcast. The seal creatures told the Basque they inhabited the Earth and other spaces and communicated between them through radio. At this point, Mel began talking about a fictional substance called Ice-9, which was written about by Kurt Vonnegut in his novel Cat's Cradle. In the story, Ice-9 is an alternative structure of water that's solid at room temperature and causes liquid water to instantly freeze and transform into more Ice-9. It's developed for the military to solidify mud, but if it was to continue to solidify the mud and subsequently absorb all of the Earth's water, it would eventually destroy the planet. Art Bell hypothesized that maybe there was a real thing similar to Ice-9, and Mel said his internet research showed that there were scientists who believed something like that could exist. Mel said the Basque were warned by the seal creature about the ice, that it could and would destroy the world in a very short amount of time, and was too dangerous to fool around with, since we have no way of understanding how it works. The burnable ice the hole produced seemed to be an inexhaustible source of power, so the seal creature realized it would be very tempting to make it. It warned that greedy and undisciplined use of the ice would probably occur in this world. Mel felt the ice would be very dangerous if not contained properly. He said that the ice is rare, but when it's discovered, it's almost always improperly used. He also said the seal creature had informed the Basque that there were other people in other worlds similar to ours who wanted our world for their own. It said our world was in fairly good shape, and the other worlds were even worse than our world would be after a nuclear holocaust. According to the seal creature, those people monitor what happens in this world. They think we're on a collision course to disaster. When we're gone, they can come here, and they even think they're smart enough to use the ice our bottomless holes can produce. Mel also brought up a man called Red Elk, a self-described intertribal medicine man who'd called Art's show before talking about subterranean creatures he called rock flyers. According to Red Elk, these rock flyers were said to be creatures who lived within the earth. He said they were a form of spiritual being, but spiritual physical. They had the ability to fly and lived within rock. The person who told Red Elk about rock flyers inferred they were some form of angel. Red Elk seemed to believe that Mel's seal creature may be a shape-shifting form of rock flyer. He referred to this particular creature as Mel's totem. Red Elk himself had never come across a rock flyer, but he had experience with many totems. Mel felt that rock flyers not only lived down in the earth, but inhabited different earths and were able to move between them. Art said that it's crossed his mind that very, very deep within the earth, there may be different laws of physics that alter reality as we know it. In another strange twist, Mel told Art that just prior to going to Nevada and discovering the second bottomless hole, he'd been diagnosed with a particularly lethal form of esophageal cancer and was given about 6 months to live. After his intense experience with the seal creature, he started feeling a lot better. He traveled back to the Pacific Northwest to see the doctor who'd diagnosed him. The doctor confirmed that he could no longer find any evidence of cancer in Mel's body. Mel felt the seal creature had cured his cancer, remembering the feeling of incredible compassion he'd felt when looking into its humanish eyes. He also felt that the creature seemingly being born from a giant tumor wasn't a coincidence. He said the Basque man who'd shared the experience with him had also been profoundly moved and changed by what they'd witnessed. He also said that with the hole on his former land in Washington state no longer accessible to him, he now wanted to be thrown into the Nevada hole upon his death. So I'd imagine you're wondering why there's no photographic evidence of anything Mel told to Art Bell over the course of those few years. Art did ask for pictures every time he spoke to Mel, and Mel would usually say he'd do everything within his power to get one, but no photos ever materialized. At one point, he said the reason he didn't get any photos at the Nevada mystery hole was because he and the group of Basque men had camped on the property during their experiments, apparently as sort of a spur-of-the-moment decision, and nobody came or went. Therefore, nobody went to retrieve a camera, and he didn't want to encroach on what little they had by asking them for anything. He said he felt enormously privileged just being allowed to be there. And as for the possibility of retrieving the sheep carcass, Mel said they were originally going to bury it, but that didn't feel right, so they dumped the sheep and everything involved in the experiment into the hole. But toward the end of his radio show conversations, Mel had a whole new excuse for failing to take any pictures. He'd casually mentioned that the Nevada hole couldn't be seen from a distance. He said you could see everything around it, like the nearby Basque encampment, from higher hills in the area, but the hole itself and its protruding metal collar wasn't visible even while flying overhead. I assumed he meant that had something to do with the angles in the landscape, but apparently not. He said that his nephew had tried everything he could to take a picture of the dime the Basque elder had given him, but was completely unable to do so. That's when Mel realized that while he could hold the dime and see it just fine up close, when he stood 15 feet or more away, it vanished. He could still see the lucite case he kept the dime in, but he could completely see through it as if it were empty. As he walked toward the dime, it became visible again. Then Mel said that he believed the Nevada hole's metal collar was similar to the dime, and it no longer registered to the eye or mind from a certain distance. This also apparently made it impossible to photograph. Plenty of Art Bell's listeners had volunteered over the years to be lowered into either of Mel's holes with lights and cameras, regardless of the risk. Since the Washington hole was so quickly seized by the government, that one was clearly a no-go. When it came to the Nevada hole, it had simply proven to be too dangerous, with what had happened to the wood stove and cabin, and of course the sheep. Mel never gave out the location of the Nevada mystery hole because he didn't want the Basques or Native Americans to be overrun with curiosity seekers. But in his final conversation with Art Bell, he said there had been helicopters seen flying overhead sporadically, and he thought the location would probably be better known soon, though nobody had tried to make contact with the locals. He thought it may be time to come clean to the government, or at least a university, about the hole's location, so they could study and contain the dangerous substance that can turn ice into a perpetual heat source and could potentially suck all of the moisture from the planet. He planned to talk to the Basque about that. He did say nobody had ever experienced anything that would be indicative of the hole being radioactive, so that's good, I guess. He told Art he planned to go back to Nevada soon. He'd been invited to stay with the Native Americans and the Basque to further study the plants and the hole. He promised he'd do his best to take pictures while he was there. But Mel never did go back, at least at the time of his and Art's final conversation. He said he felt people may have been following him, and he didn't want to lead them there. He also mentioned that he had laid low in general because people badgered him, presumably for money, all the time, even though he didn't have a nickel in his pocket. With Art Bell being located in Nevada, I wonder if he ever tried to get Mel to sit down for an in-person interview. Mel seemed to think telling his story on the radio had overall been a positive and pleasantly unique experience for him, though Art expressed feelings of guilt for everything Mel had been through during the time they'd known each other. People have asked what the odds are of one person finding 2 bottomless holes. I suppose the odds are a lot better if you make it public knowledge to a huge audience of conspiracy and mystery enthusiasts that you're interested in them. Mel also told Art Bell that he felt there was a very strong connection between the Heaven's Gate cult and his Washington mystery hole. Heaven's Gate was a UFO-fixated suicide cult who believed they could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature, which would ascend them to heaven, also referred to as the next level or the evolutionary level above human, aboard a UFO. 39 members of the group committed suicide on March 26, 1997 in Rancho Santa Fe, California, about a month after Mel Waters' first on-air conversation with Art Bell, and Mel considered this potentially significant. Mel asked for anyone to contact him if they'd seen the cult leader, Marshall Applewhite, in the vicinity of his property or the hole prior to the group's suicide. I'm not sure how the Heaven's Gate mass suicide was supposed to be related to Mel's hole, considering they left behind an update on their website, making it clear their deaths were designed to coincide with the Hale-Bopp comet's approach. Another famous cult has also been brought up in relation to Mel's holes, the Manson family. This connection also doesn't seem very likely. It's pretty much just based on the fact that Charles Manson often made reference to a bottomless pit that he'd lead his cult to when all of their prophesied Helter Skelter nonsense came to be. Many believers of Mel Waters' stories about his mysterious bottomless pit subscribe to the notion that his pit and Manson's were one and the same, for, as far as I can tell, no particular reason. From the things I've read about the Manson family over the years, I always thought the bottomless pit they referenced was supposed to be located in Death Valley, California. There's not much we know for certain about Mel's hole. What we do know is that local news reporters have searched extensively and found no public records that any such person as Mel Waters was ever listed as residing in or owning property in that area of Washington state, or any credible evidence that the hole exists. At one point, he claimed his ex-wife worked for Central Washington University, but they found no proof of that either. Mel eventually told Art Bell that the property was actually in his ex-wife's name. I'd assume the reporters checked those records as well. According to State Department of Natural Resources geologist and Kittitas County local Jack Powell, the existence of Mel's Washington hole is geologically impossible. He stated that a hole of the depth claimed would collapse into itself under the tremendous pressure and heat from the surrounding strata. Powell theorizes that a nearby old mine shaft was probably the inspiration for the Mel's Hole stories, and commented that the hole had established itself as a legend based on no evidence at all, and it certainly has become a bona fide urban legend. Most people question whether the entire Mel's Hole saga was a hoax, and if so, was Art Bell in on it? Was Mel Waters a plant or actor for the Coast To Coast A.M. radio show? After Mel's first interview with Art Bell, no one seemed to question the identity of Mel Waters, even if they questioned the validity of his story. And whether they believed it or not, listeners were enthralled by the bizarre details Mel would share, which decreased in believability each time he was interviewed and added to them. After he was featured on Coast to Coast A.M. several times, people started looking into public records, hoping to determine the exact location of the hole. After discovering no record of anybody by the name of Mel Waters having voted, paid taxes, or owning land in Curiositas County, Washington, and there being no property transfers in the area during the time Mel claimed to have lost his land to the government, many listeners quickly became distrustful of everything Mel, if that was his real name, had to say. But there is one intriguing piece of potential evidence that supports that part of Mel's story may be true. Mel's nephew, who he'd stayed with after returning from Australia, took a keen interest in the story and started digging for proof to support his uncle. While looking for Mel's land on an early satellite imagery site called TerraServer, sort of a forerunner to Google Earth and Google Maps, he found something very peculiar. When looking at the imagery of Ellensburg, Washington, he zoomed out a bit, about 5 miles southwest of the town, right along Monastash Ridge. There, he discovered a 4 by 8 mile area that was just completely whited out. Normally, you could see a property pretty clearly on that imaging, right down to the cars in the yard. But all he saw there were 2 connected white squares that Mel claimed to be his former property, erased from the map. I believe that satellite picture was dated June of 2000. When Mel mentioned this on Art Bell's broadcast, Coast to Coast A.M. listeners temporarily crashed the TerraServer website in an effort to confirm that information, and they did succeed in finding it. That was the one piece of evidence that Mel Waters was ever able to provide to indicate that something fishy may actually be going on along Monastash Ridge. This is the evidence everyone pulls out when debating this to this day. But Mel also mentioned that very close to his land was the Yakima firing range. He claimed that after his property was seized, the area of the firing range was expanded, conveniently also expanding the no-fly zone above it. From what I can find online, the actual name of that location is the Yakima Training Center, formerly the Yakima Firing Center. It's an Army training center used for maneuver training, land warrior system testing, and a live fire exercise area. It does have a boundary along Monastash Ridge. The U.S. Army has actually leased and later purchased land there since 1942. If indeed Mel's, or more accurately his ex-wife's, property was seized by the government, it seems like it could have been with the specific intent to expand their military property. It also seems possible to me that the military did obtain the property, but it wasn't seized at all, and was actually purchased from Mel's ex-wife. But then again, it seems like that would be a matter of public record. Though if they're using it for something top secret, I'm not sure how that works. Since the TerraServer website as it was then can seemingly no longer be accessed, I'm not sure how common it was for areas to be blocked out like that. I'm not sure if they might have regularly done that for certain military facilities. It seems like obvious big white blobs would draw more attention to it. To this day, there are still some die-hard believers, and people still venture out into rural Curiositas County in search of Mel's Hole. The exact location of Mel's Hole was never specified, but several people have claimed to have found it, though they've provided no actual proof. One of those people was Gerald R. Osborne, the man I mentioned earlier who went by Red Elk. Osborne, a Curiositas Valley local, claimed he'd visited the hole several times since 1961, when his father took him there and informed him the hole was bottomless. He also claimed the hole was located on a top-secret U.S. government base where annual alien activity occurred on the summer solstice. In 2002, Osborne agreed to lead 30 people on an expedition to the hole and was unable to locate it. Others claim to have found Mel's Hole on Google Maps, located in northern Ellensburg, but when people went out there to check it out, all they found was an old mine about 50 feet deep. It sounds like this could have been the mine geologist Jack Powell had been talking about. Mel told Art Bell that his nephew was writing a book about his story. I don't know if that book was ever finished or published, but a couple others have been. They talked about how songs had been written about Mel's Hole, and said he had drinks named after him. Mel seemed pretty happy about that. That interview was in 2000, I believe. More recently, in January of this year, I came across ads for a Mel's Hole-inspired art installation, which was on display at the Soil Gallery in Seattle, Washington. Rebroadcasts of Mel's appearances on Coast to Coast A.M. have kept the mystery and intrigue of Mel's Hole alive for over 2 decades, and created what's been described as a modern rural myth. It's unknown whether the man who called himself Mel Waters is still alive. In his April 2000 interview with Art Bell, he said he was 68 years old. That would make him 91 today, so it is possible. I've actually been working on this story off and on since 2021, before I even started my channel. After listening to all of the Coast to Coast A.M. interviews very carefully, I have formed some personal opinions. First off, Mel sounded like an intelligent, well-spoken, knowledgeable, and genuinely interesting guy. He came off as someone I'd really enjoy having a conversation with. Mel wasn't selling anything or personally gaining from his notoriety. In fact, the guy was like a ghost. Nobody could find any public information on him at all. Mel said his only goal was to leave a permanent record of what happened. With each new installation of the Mel's Hole saga, Art would have Mel recap what he'd talked about before, and his story stayed surprisingly consistent over the years. In fact, it was so consistent that there seemed to be a lot of subtle foreshadowing and earlier calls very easily missed that sort of came back to tie everything together in later calls. I realized about 2.5 recordings in that literally no information included in Mel's story was erroneous. These were basically just two guys chatting on the phone, but even the details that initially seemed irrelevant turned out to be important in later calls. That seems unnatural. It's like the story seems more believable because it's so consistent, but that's also what makes me suspect it was all an ingeniously woven fabrication. It all weaves together too seamlessly. Maybe it's just my ADHD talking, but it doesn't seem humanly possible that anybody could keep their thoughts that focused or their memory that clear over the course of multiple phone calls that took place over the span of 5 years without a script. Art Bell made some empty gestures, like having Mel swear on a Bible that he was telling the truth, but he really didn't try to poke holes in Mel's story, or demand evidence, or really challenge the narrative at all. It seems to me that he just wanted to keep the story going. Disproving anything within the story would ruin the very popular continuing saga he was milking a lot of content out of. And in reality, Art Bell's show was never meant to investigate, it was meant to entertain. I loved that show growing up, but I always saw it as I saw the tabloid newspapers my grandmother would buy. We always knew they were just fun, entertaining stories, for the most part. Nowadays, there seem to be more people willing to believe every story they're told, as long as it involves a good conspiracy theory. I wouldn't be surprised if Mel's Hole becomes more popular now than ever. The other part of my personal conspiracy theory is that this was all an elaborate but impressively subtle, slow-burn public service announcement, telling us we need to take better care of our planet before it's too late. I have a feeling a good portion of Art Bell's listeners were the sort of people who needed to be spoon-fed that sort of message in a more palatable way than just giving them the statistics. Mel waited until the very last call to turn the conversation toward conservation. If you listen for yourself, I think you'll see what I mean. Mel seemed to be pretty well read, casually dropping literary references here and there throughout his conversations with Art. I can't help but wonder how many of the themes he'd read about over the years, along with his lived experiences and the stories he'd heard on Art's show, made it into this story. Whether Art Bell was in on it or not, I have no idea. Whether any of this was true or not, I have no idea. All I know for sure is that Mel Waters was a man with an epic story to tell, a man who was likable, believable, and relatable, who may have never existed at all. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this story and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have a theory on these crazy holes, leave it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.